Hey YouTube, so in this video I want to talk about dialetheism, the view that there are true contradictions. I'm very sympathetic to dialetheism. I think that there are contradictions everywhere, or at least there can be contradictions everywhere if that's what you want. And in this video I'm going to explain how you can get contradictions everywhere, if that's what you want. So I take it that I can introduce new words into the language. I can define a new term and stipulate the rules for how to use it, right? Like that's pretty common. You know, people introduce new words all the time. So here's a new word, wulture. And the rules for using the term wulture are as follows. Rule number 1 is that wulture applies to all things that are vultures. Rule number 2 is that wulture excludes all things that are white. And that's it. So those two rules constitute the application conditions for the use of the word wulture. These rules are very simple. I don't think anyone should have any trouble understanding them. And again, you know, this is just a stipulative definition. I've just invented this new word and I've told you what the rules are for using it. Okay, so now suppose I come across Delia. Delia is a white vulture. Is Delia a wulture? Well, by rule number 1, wulture applies to all things that are vultures, and Delia is a vulture, so wulture correctly applies, so Delia is a wulture. By rule number 2, that wulture excludes all things that are white, Delia is white, so wulture does not apply. So Delia is not a wulture. So Delia both is and is not a wulture. It is the case that Delia is a wulture, and it is not the case that Delia is a wulture. It is both true and false that Delia is a wulture. So there you are. There is a true contradiction. And it should be pretty obvious that you can use the same method to generate contradictions anywhere else, right? But like you can endlessly generate these sorts of words, and you can have contradictions absolutely everywhere. So the question is, I mean, is this good enough, right? So I've suggested that what we have here is a true contradiction. Does this work, right? Does this really establish dialetheism? Well, one objection might be that the concept wulture is in some way defective in virtue of the fact that it entails an inconsistency. Now, obviously, the mere fact that the concept entails an inconsistency isn't going to be enough in this context to show that it's defective, because in this context, we're talking with respect to the debate between people who think that there are true contradictions and people who deny this. And the whole point of introducing this concept of wulture is that it entails an inconsistency. So, yes, I mean, it entails an inconsistency, but that fact alone can't show that it's defective, at least not without begging the question. So, but, you know, maybe we would say, well, you know, the trouble with concepts that entail inconsistencies is that they are, in some sense, unintelligible or meaningless. Now, I don't think that the idea of unintelligibility is going to work here, because it really does seem to me to be totally straightforward, totally intelligible. You know, like how to understand this term, right? So like the rules for using the term wulture are easy to understand. There really shouldn't be any difficulty understanding either of those two rules, right? So we have the claim that it applies to all things that are vultures, it excludes all things that are white. I mean, that's easy. There's no there's no unintelligibility there. And moreover, we can also very easily see how these rules generate a contradiction, right? So when we look at Delia, who is a white vulture, right, we can see the kind of conflict, right? We can see like, oh yeah, given these rules, the term both applies and fails to apply. Whereas if I showed you a black vulture, you'd be like, oh well, a black vulture, the term just applies to it, right? That's not there's no contradiction there. So we easily understand both of the rules for the use of the term. We easily understand how they generate a contradiction. So it doesn't seem to me that there's anything unintelligible here. Okay then, so another objection might be that this isn't really a case of a true contradiction. What I've said is that Delia both is a wulture and is not a wulture. But we might say, well, instead of attributing contradiction, we should instead say that this is that what's happening is that Delia is a partial wulture. Like Delia is kind of half a wulture. So yeah, it's not that she is a wulture and is not a wulture, it's that she's just sort of in between. Now, I think that this kind of move totally makes sense. It's totally intuitive when we're dealing with vague boundary cases, okay? So there are going to be certain cases where it just isn't clear whether or not the application conditions for a term are satisfied. Where, you know, like maybe we have certain determinate cases where, you know, the term is determinately satisfied, cases where the term determinately isn't satisfied, and then there's just cases in between where we're like, we're just not really sure whether or not this term applies. So think about the term bald. Well, I am not bald, right? Clearly, I've got a nice full head of hair. Now, I could start losing my hair and I could become bald. And so, you know, we have right now, I'm determinately not bald, and then as time goes on, maybe there will be a time where I am determinately bald. But then there's going to be some point like in between where it just isn't clear whether or not I'm bald. It's just vague, right? And so we might say, oh well, what's happening there is that Cain is partially bald. You know, it's not that he both is bald and is not bald. No, he's just partially bald. So maybe we'd say the same about the wulture case, right? Delia is just partially a wulture. The trouble with this move, I think, is that it doesn't seem to me like this actually is analogous to a vague boundary case. So in the case of Delia's wulturehood, right, well, Delia determinately satisfies the first rule. So like Delia just is a vulture. There's no question that Delia is a vulture. You know, she's not like on the cusp of being a vulture or anything like that. No, she just is a vulture. And by definition, the term wulture applies to things that are vultures. Similarly, Delia is determinately white. She is a brilliant, dazzling white. So she's clearly white, and therefore determinately satisfies rule number 2, like the second rule, which excludes things that are white. So there's no vagueness here, right? Like the term wulture applies and it does not apply. I mean, it's like, okay, what would it mean to say that Delia is a partial wulture? Like when we say that something is a partial X, I take it, see, to me, that I can kind of make sense of that if I think, well, you know, again, there are sort of clear cases of X, right? There's clear cases of not X, and then there's like something in the middle, where again it's just sort of, you know, it's not really clear. We're like, well, we're not really sure. But in this case, we actually are sure, right? We can say very clearly, Delia clearly is a vulture. She clearly is white, and so clearly the term wulture applies, and clearly it does not apply. I mean, I think that, look, in principle, if you really want to say that Delia is a partial wulture, I mean, that's fine, right? We can use language however we want, but it strikes me as just much more intuitive and straightforward to say that Delia is and is not a wulture, right? Like that seems like the more straightforward way of describing what's happening here. Of course, yeah. So like, if you insist on banishing contradiction from your language, banishing inconsistency, then you can talk in terms of like partial wulturehood. But I think there's a relevant difference between the case of Delia's, you know, being both a wulture and not a wulture, and the case where like I might lose hair and it's just not clear whether or not I'm bald. Okay, so another objection to this idea would be, look, this is just a linguistic trick, okay? I've just invented this word. I've proposed these two rules, and like, yeah, like, of course you can come up with rules that entail inconsistencies. This is just semantic trickery. What we're looking for is a contradiction in the world, right? So when we're talking about whether or not there are true contradictions, really what we're talking about is, are there contradictions in the world? Are there contradictory facts, contradictory properties? So the question here will be, well, what exactly is it to have a contradiction in the world? I take it that contradiction is a property of propositions. So we have a contradiction when we have a proposition that's both true and false, or both true and not true. And truth and falsehood are, I think, properties of propositions, sentences. So I have introduced this term. We can state the proposition that Delia is a wulture. That proposition is both true and false. So that seems to me to be perfectly fine as a candidate for a contradiction in the world. Now, the idea that truth and falsehood are property of proposition. So what I'm saying is, okay, truth and falsehood, they're properties of propositions. It isn't clear to me what it would mean to say that truth and falsehood are properties of, the objects in the world that are picked out by propositions. So suppose that we're talking about a mountain, right? I point at a mountain. Now, obviously, we can say things about the mountain that are true or false. So if it's Mount Everest, like I point at Mount Everest and I say, look, Mount Everest, that's the tallest mountain on the earth. Well, that proposition is true. Or I could point at it and say, Mount Everest, that's a pink elephant. Well, that proposition is false. But if I just point at Mount Everest and I say, look, Mount Everest, that object, that is true. I'm not sure what's being said there, right? Like, can a mountain just in itself be true or false? That seems like a very odd way of speaking, at the very least, right? No, it's propositions about the mountain that can be true or false. But to just say that, like, this object just in itself is true or it's just false would be a bit strange. So, yeah, look, what I'm offering is a proposition that is both true and false, and it seems to me like that's enough. But maybe we can push this objection. So we might say, well, look, what we're looking for is like a contradiction. So when we're sort of talking about contradictions in the world, we might think that what we're looking for is like a contradiction that we could perceive, a contradiction that could manifest in experience. So, well, what is it exactly to perceive a contradiction? Actually, Graham Priest gives some nice examples of what it might be like to perceive a contradiction. So he suggests, first of all, so one thing he suggests is the Penrose stairs. So there's this like an impossible object called the Penrose stairs, where it's just a 2D image, but it represents a 3D object, and the 3D object is a set of stairs which continuously gets higher. So as you walk around the set of stairs, you would just continuously go higher and higher and higher endlessly. But it sort of circles in on itself. So if you take a particular point on the Penrose stairs, then that point is both higher than itself and not higher than itself. So Priest says, well, if we were sort of seeing things like the Penrose stairs in real life, then we would be seeing contradictions. Like, this is a contradictory object. He also gives the example of if you are sitting on a train and there's another train outside the window and then the other train starts moving, well, when you see the other train start moving, that can create the sensation of movement. So like the visual impression of the other train moving can kind of make you think that you're moving, but at the same time you will have the tactile sensations of being stationary, right? Like you like visually you kind of see movement, but in terms of what you feel You don't feel acceleration. So there's this kind of weird feeling you get where it's almost as if you're both moving and not moving at the same time. So Priest says that would be what it's like to perceive a contradictory situation. So obviously, in that actual situation, you're not right. It's not really contradictory; it's an illusion. But that's what it would be like to perceive the contradiction of both moving and not moving at the same time. And of course, this example of Delia being a wulture, it being both true and false that Delia is a wulture, well, this doesn't induce any sort of strange perceptual experiences, right? No, I mean, what we have is just a white bird, okay? Like, that's it. And there's nothing unusual about a white bird. So maybe that's the sense in which this seems like it's just linguistic trickery. Okay. There's a couple of things to say about this idea of perceiving contradictions. First of all, Paul Cabet makes a nice point in response to Priest, which is, Priest has said that these examples show us what it would be like to perceive a contradiction. But as Cabet points out, if you accept the standard view, which is that the world is consistent, then actually the examples that Priest has provided are examples of what it is like to perceive a perfectly consistent situation, right? So when I show you a picture of the Penrose stairs, I'm not showing you a 3D object. I'm not showing you a contradictory object. No, I'm showing you a 2D depiction. And the piece of paper on which the Penrose stairs is drawn is totally consistent. The drawing is totally consistent, at least on the standard view, right? So when you look at that, the experience you're having is the experience of a consistent situation. Similarly with sitting on the train, right? It's an experience of a consistent situation. Yes, it's a bit weird, but it's consistent, at least on the standard view. So those examples show us what it would be like to perceive consistency, if you think that the world is consistent. Okay then, well, then that raises the question, okay, well, yeah, but what would it be like to perceive a contradiction? Well, I say it would be just like this, because the world is contradictory. So this is what it's like to perceive a contradiction. You want to know what it's like to perceive a contradiction? Well, just go and look at a white bird. Go and look at a white vulture. And there you are. That's what it's like to perceive a contradiction. I mean, I think maybe we can approach this from sort of the opposite direction, right? Like, suppose that there were contradictions in the world in the sense that the objector is asking, right? So whatever exactly that would mean. And then suppose that you can perceive it and this kind of manifests in your experience. So let's say, for instance, that I have a box and I open the box, and when you look in it, you see that the box is both empty and occupied at the same time. It's both empty and not empty at the same time, in the same sense, right? And it's just like, wow, like what? Mind blown. Like I can't make sense of what I'm seeing. Like what is this, right? So it's just totally crazy, right? It's and it's something that you're perceiving. Okay, so you look at it and you're like, yep, that's it. That's a contradiction right there. Dialetheism wins. Now, notice that you could introduce a single term, a single predicate for this contradictory state. So the box is both occupied and empty. The box is occu-empty. Okay, well, I have this term, occu-empty, and I can use it to refer to the state inside the box. And now, of course, I can have the propositions. I can generate propositions like, this box is occu-empty. That box is not occu-empty. And notice that these propositions can form part of a totally consistent language, right? Like they can be perfectly well behaved from the point of view of classical logic. because I just have this word OcuEmpty, and like I could use that word. I mean, from like again, I can generate a proposition like this box is OcuEmpty, that box is not OcuEmpty. I could have a language that is perfectly consistent, but it just has this term OcuEmpty. Now, of course, we can see, oh yeah, OcuEmpty is referring to what we would describe as a contradictory state, but the language in which that term is being used is totally consistent. Because, I mean, like, if you take a proposition, this box is OcuEmpty, well, when you sort of apply classical logic to that, you just, you just represent it with the variable p, and then, you can use that in arguments. You can say if p, then q, p, therefore q, etc. Right? But yeah, we could have what looks like a perfectly consistent language for describing these contradictory things. So, in a contradictory world, we could have a perfectly consistent language. And I want to suggest that actually that's kind of already the case. The world is contradictory, or at least it can be contradictory. But we have just chosen to have a perfectly consistent language. So the idea is well, so the objection was that this example of the word wulture is just a piece of linguistic trickery. But I actually think, no, in whatever sense we can assign to the idea of there being contradictions in the world, actually we really do have a contradiction in the world, right? Like this gives us a contradictory fact or a contradictory property, right? Like wulturehood is a contradictory property, or like Delia is a wulture, right? That's a contradictory fact. She both is and is not a wulture. Okay, so that's the idea. Now, obviously, I'm aware that there are other issues with suggesting that there are true contradictions. So, one obvious problem is, well, at least within classical logic, a contradiction entails everything. From a contradiction, everything follows. So if you assert both P and not P, then you can derive any other proposition. So if I say that it is the case that Delia is a wulture, and it is not the case that Delia is a wulture, then I can derive that Santa Claus exists. That's called the principle of explosion. Now, I am perfectly familiar with the principle of explosion. Okay, I do know. I know all about explosion. Okay, so it would take a whole other video to outline my take on logic. Suffice it to say, for the context of this video, there are paraconsistent logics that tolerate contradictions. There are logics on which explosion fails, where you can't just derive anything from a contradiction. So, don't worry, right? Even if you believe that there are true contradictions, you're not necessarily going to end up in crazy land where you have to affirm every proposition. So, yeah, that's basically the argument. I guess I just want to end by saying, do you know about wands? Do you know what a wand is? So, wand, the way that this term works is wand the term wand applies to all things that are hands, and it excludes all things that have white skin. So, here is one wand, here is another. Therefore, the world is contradictory, incoherent, and completely impossible.